Welcome and good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for Flagstone Office Hours. I'm Amy Ochmoody, and this quarter our education topic has focused on financial considerations in divorce. You can find our supporting blog articles on our website, www.flagstonefm.com. I'm honored to be joined today by Flagstone's founder and lead wealth advisor, Michael Johnson, and Jane Langen-Mock, an attorney from Rembolt-Ledke Law Firm. Flagstone Financial Management is a registered investment advisor. Information presented is for educational purposes and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Be sure to first consult with a qualified financial advisor and/or tax professional before implementing any strategy discussed. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. With that, Mike, I'll let you introduce Jane.
Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it. And Jane, thanks so much for being here. Jane and I have known each other, I don't know, 15, 20 years, something like that. So it's great to see you here, and even better to be a partner with yours with our clients and helping get good legal advice for them. Jane has represented a lot of our, not a lot, but a handful of our clients, and is our go-to person if anybody is looking for an attorney in the areas of divorce. So on a more formal introduction basis, Jane focuses her practice on family law issues, particularly complex divorce, paternity, custody, child support, and adoption matters, including trial and appellate work. Jane is a certified Parenting Act mediator. She also works with the rehabilitation or liquidation of insurance companies. Jane teaches pretrial litigation skills and family law at the University of Nebraska College of Law, and has been a regular speaker. And just as I've known Jane throughout the years, very active in state bar and national bar kind of work. So she's super active outside of even her practice, which is always impressive. Jane is an AV-rated Martindale Hubbell attorney, demonstrating the highest level of professional excellence and high standards. She has a perfect 10.0 rating on avo.com and is listed in Nebraska's 10 best in client satisfaction with the American Institute of Family Law Attorneys, and she is active in the Nebraska State Bar Association. And I will also add, our clients also have just had wonderful things to say. And the thing I appreciate most about Jane is her sort of practical, common sense way of approaching a very emotional subject. So she does a great job with that. So anyway, with that, Jane, I'll turn it over to you to kind of educate us on a variety of topics related to divorce. And then afterwards, we'll have a handful of questions from either that were posed outside of here or that we've come up with to kind of fill in the blanks. So
fantastic. Thank you. And thanks for having me. I prepared a PowerPoint. I'm going to skip some of the slides because I know we don't have a tremendous amount of time, but I will make this available too if anyone would like to have that afterwards. I have to figure out my little share screen. Okay. So I'm going to start. Is this working? Is it sharing?
Yep. You're looking good.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how you can plan for how to deal with your finances by way of a premarital agreement, and then talk a little bit about what happens to your finances in the context of a divorce. So let me start by talking about premarital agreements. Those are sometimes called prenups, a prenuptial agreement, a premarital agreement. They're all the same thing. And essentially what that is it is a contract that you and your future spouse enter into that deals with how you are going to address your property and debt in the event of an eventual divorce, separation, or an annulment. What premarital agreements do primarily is they set rules for divorce. They can also set rules for death. That's particularly important maybe in a second marriage or a subsequent marriage where people already have children and they already want to plan for the passing of their estate to some of the children that were involved prior to this particular marriage. And you can also set rules for what will happen during the marriage, how property will be handled, who will manage property, conditions on selling property, and that sort of thing. What they don't do, though, is they don't control matters that aren't specifically set forth in the agreement. So you don't get to imply a lot of terms if you're interpreting a premarital agreement. They need to say what they mean and mean what they say. They also can't control custody or parenting time of children. Those are considered by courts to be determined in the best interests of the children, which is something you can't plan for in advance. You can control alimony, but when I say in here you can't control support, you cannot control the support of children by way of a premarital agreement. I think there's an assumption that people who should have premarital agreements are when you have a man that has a bunch of money. I would recommend that everyone consider a premarital agreement. I mean, we're in the state of Nebraska. We're at a historic time of wealth transfer, tremendous amount of farmland, businesses that are transferring from one generation to the next. That's always the case in this state, but I think we're going to have some of the biggest wealth transfer in history here coming up in the next decade or so. So anyone who has any sort of business interest or expected inheritance should consider a premarital agreement. And also, if you have a second or a later marriage where you've already accumulated some assets and perhaps already have some beneficiaries in mind, you want to consider a premarital agreement as well. The reason to do them is that you can make your own rules. People are tending to get married later. Statistics show that a lot of people live together before they get married. And so when they get married, they may have already significantly advanced in their careers or may already have property. And we're more exposed to divorce than before. I mean, the divorce rate isn't necessarily rising, but approximately 50% of marriages do end in divorce, and no one thinks they're going to get divorced at the time they're getting married, but obviously some of those people end up being wrong.
Did you see COVID change that much? Did COVID change?
When COVID first started, everything froze, including the court system.
Mm-hmm.
So there were people who were in the process of divorce that just kind of couldn't move forward one way or the other. There were people who maybe would have started a divorce, but decided not to. They were insecure about their finances, their jobs, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I only had a couple of cases that I would say COVID perhaps contributed to their divorce or caused their divorce. People who weren't getting along that well, but ended up spending a lot of time together, locked in a little home, and discovered they didn't agree so well.
Yeah. Cool.
I'm gonna skip forward a little and just talk about how property does get divided in a divorce. And in Nebraska, we have a 3-step process. First, you classify the property. Generally, the rule in Nebraska is that there's a presumption that any property you own at the time of divorce is marital property, meaning it's subject to being divided. It can be awarded to either party or sold, but the proceeds or the item are shared or counted in some way. The exceptions to that typically are property that you had prior to the marriage, an inheritance that you received, whether before or during the marriage, or a gift that you received from someone other than your spouse. And there are a bunch of technical rules that I won't try to get into right now about what happens if property gets mingled. You know, for example, if you had an account, and this is probably something that your clients will see from time to time, Mike, is you may have an investment account with a certain value, but then you put some more money in during the marriage and then you sell part of it. And that gets very complex. That's beyond the scope, but those are the kinds of things that lawyers and financial advisors can work on really well together to try to help people sort through those. And then you value it. What's it worth? With accounts and things, that's usually not very difficult unless there's a tax consequence. And in most retirement accounts, that is the case. Sometimes with real estate, we have to get appraisals and that sort of thing, but we determine the value. And then the last step is allocation. In other words, who's going to get this? I think sometimes people assume that if something is marital, that means it's shared. But we don't take the credit card and assign half of it to one spouse and half of it to the other spouse. That happens, but rarely. You end up then in a situation where somebody misses the payment, and then you have to recalculate of how much is owed. And then what if there's a late fee and who gets stuck with that? So instead, we try to allocate with certain assets and debts assigned to one party, other assets and debts assigned to the other party, and then we try to equalize that. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip forward on some things. I will talk just a minute about allocation. Typically, we want to start with the idea that if an asset is in one person's name, it makes sense for that asset to go to that person. That isn't always going to be the case. And just because an account or an asset is in one person's name doesn't automatically mean it will go to that person, right? If it's considered a marital asset, it could be awarded to the other spouse. It could be ordered sold. But typically it makes sense if both people have say a similar retirement, it makes sense for each person to keep their own retirement, that sort of thing. And then we can move forward from there. Then we look at sort of who's got an emotional tie to something. There may be a household item, for example, it's perhaps marital. It was maybe gifted to both parties as a wedding gift or something like that, but it's from one person's family and it means something to them. So we try to do some things like that. And, when we're dividing up property, sometimes you just look at what does everybody want and can we make that happen? And if so, what do we have to do to equalize things from there? Tax issues. There are a number of tax issues. Again, this can get very complicated, but the simplistic approach is child support is not a taxable event. So if one party is ordered to pay child support to the other, that child support does not get deducted by the party who pays it, and it's not includable in income by the party who receives it. For a long time, alimony was deductible to the payor and is income to the payee. That changed with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So you may have a circumstance where, and Mike, this may happen with some of your clients, they may have an old divorce order that required alimony, and they do get to deduct it, even though that rule has changed now. But for orders entered after that act went into effect, it's no longer deductible to the party paying, and it's not considered income to the other party.
Well, I feel like one of the things that came up once was the fact that somebody tried to get their alimony adjusted. And so it was a new order, and therefore it came after the 2017 date. And so it was no longer deductible. So which is an interesting little quirk in that rule.
And there is an IRS guideline. I'd have to check and see if it's been superseded, but I had that issue come up once and I did some research. There is an IRS guideline that says that a modified order could still be deductible, but the judge has to specifically make a finding that it should continue to be deductible under the original order.
Interesting. Have you seen lower alimony awards as a result of this tax shift, or no?
Honestly, no. Now that argument gets made a lot. Someone says, well, if there's a case similar to this case, and before the law changed, alimony was X dollars, but it was deductible, right? So now the same amount of dollars should be something else, right? So let's say the person was paying $2,000 a month, but it was deductible. Now you might argue that $1,500 now would be the appropriate order.
Right.
But honestly, I think our judges are becoming more and more generous. They are perhaps less likely to award alimony than they were, but when alimony is awarded, the awards tend to be higher.
Okay.
And then the other thing is that property that is awarded incident to divorce isn't taxable unless it was taxable anyway. So, for example, if we're talking about a financial account like you might handle, Mike, if the money is in an IRA in husband's name, and the divorce decree says that this IRA will now be awarded to wife, that does not create a tax effect for wife. If wife rolls it over into another qualified account, you treat it as though the funds in it were always her deposits, and she'll be taxed on withdrawal just the same as if it had always been in her name. If, though, husband transfers that account to wife and she cashes it out, she'll immediately have that tax consequence. If the agreement is husband, instead of saying husband will roll over his IRA to wife, if it says husband will pay X dollars to wife, and husband decides the way he's going to pay the dollars is to cash out the IRA, now he has the tax consequence. That may not be significant if you're in the middle of your divorce and if you're at a spot where you're going to file a joint return for that year anyway. But those things tend to happen after an agreement is made, and they may be in a taxable year where the parties aren't filing a joint return. I'm going to skip over spousal support and child support unless someone raises a question about it. I can always go back, but I want to real quick hit on some of the most common mistakes that I see people make. And the solutions to these might be self-explanatory, but they might not. One of the most common mistakes that I see is people just not knowing what they have. In our parents' generation, it was perhaps more common that one person earned the money and handled all the money, and the other person perhaps managed the household. But in those situations, sometimes that spouse who didn't handle the money has no idea what they have. And they'll come to me and they'll say, I have no idea if we have a retirement account. I don't know. I know that we have a house, but I don't know if we owe any money on it. And of course, the easiest thing there is to try to educate yourself, stay involved in your financial process during your marriage. And even if you don't, if it looks like things are going south, start making copies of statements, start trying to gather what you have. The other spouse can be required to provide information in that divorce process, but you never have the confidence in what that other spouse is providing the same way you do as if you get it from a source. So try to make sure that you have as much information as you can.
How often do you see, sorry, I keep interrupting you.
Okay, no, I'm glad you are.
The questions are at the top of my mind when you're talking about how, and I see it on your list down lower, but how often do you see people hiding information from other spouses? Like, I feel like it comes up occasionally in
Yeah.
things that I've seen, but
So I'm going to put that in two categories: failing to tell your attorney everything and hiding or dissipating assets. I don't see it very often because at the very beginning, my first contact with someone, I will tell people, whatever you think you're going to do, it's not going to be worth it. Because first of all, any lawyer on the other side is going to find out. And if somehow you got through the process and nobody found out, you now have a divorce decree or a settlement agreement that is subject to being reopened based on fraud. Because every settlement agreement in a divorce has to include language that says everyone has disclosed everything.
gotcha.
So if you sign that and then turns out you didn't, your former spouse can go in 2 years later and ask the court to set aside the decree. And by then you've moved on, you maybe have remarried. Now you can't even separate things anymore to try to figure things out. And it's not worth it. And the other, like I said, most of the time, somebody's going to find out anyway. And as soon as the judge finds out you did that, every advantage you might have had is gone.
Yeah.
If the judge thinks you're dishonest, it doesn't matter if you got cheated on, if you got lied to, if you got whatever. If you're lying in the process of a court system, that's going to be taken more seriously than whatever faults led to your divorce. So it's never worth it.
Yeah.
And sometimes someone will come and they'll say, well, I did this. And then we can kind of talk through, well, if you keep it on your side, we just have to disclose it. It doesn't automatically mean you got to put it back, but we just have to say that when we're counting your assets, that counts. That's something you already got.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
There's a famous case, I can't remember, I think in Michigan or something like that, where the parties owned a bunch of gold coins. And the husband so badly didn't want his wife to get him that he put the gold coins in a truck and he drove it into the lake. And so first of all, of course, his gold coins are also now gone. So that was dumb. Yeah. But also the court just treated that as if it was something he already received. The court put the full value of those gold coins on his side of the ledger. So she got most of the remaining property. And he allegedly got gold coins, but he didn't have them. So
I think it'll be interesting to see how cryptocurrency plays a role over time. I don't know if you've seen that much, and we're not big crypto fans here, but it's a thing out there, and it seems to be easier to hide that sort of stuff.
I do think it's probably easier to hide. Now, again, one of the things that happens in a divorce with the disclosures, and we can also do what we call requested discovery, where we ask the other side specifically to disclose all their accounts, including things like cryptocurrency or cash in a safe or some things that people might not think of. And those serve to jog people's memory to help them ensure that they've disclosed everything. And when that happens, if a person doesn't disclose, again, you're subject to having everything set aside.
Yeah.
The bigger issue with something like cryptocurrency is back to that 3-step process. The valuation of cryptocurrency is so volatile that it's really difficult. And tracking ownership of it is really difficult. So if you said each spouse is going to get half the cryptocurrency, I don't know how confident a person could be that whoever's managing the ownership accounts and tracking in the blockchain,
Mhm.
that actually gets done the way you think it gets done. There's so much uncertainty around it. I agree with you. It's dangerous and it's not one of my favorite things, but when it happens, obviously we deal with it.
Yep.
Representing yourself is a bad idea. The old saying is the person who represents himself has a fool for a client. There are people who don't have much and they can use the online forms, and that's fine. And not every case needs a lawyer, but most cases need a lawyer. Even people who haven't been married very long, if you have anything that's going to have a tax consequence, if you have any kind of retirement or investment account, it's worth getting a lawyer, even if all you do is have them review what you're doing and ensure that you haven't trapped yourself or created a problem that you weren't aware of.
Yep. I agree 100%. Since I
Right.
don't have a vested interest in that statement, I agree 100%.
Right. And everyone has family members or friends who've been divorced, and everyone wants to be helpful. And I appreciate that. I like it when my clients have a support group or have people they can talk to. And I think that's beneficial. But what happens sometimes is that someone says, well, my friend got divorced and her lawyer said this, or her neighbor got divorced and this is what happened, or the judge did that. Well, what I tell people is, unless you're going to tell me that your marriage is exactly like that person's, then you shouldn't expect your divorce to be exactly like that person's, right? Every case is different. The rules themselves might not seem that complicated. It's the application of the rules to the facts of the case. That's where you need a lawyer. And then just, some people don't have realistic expectations. They think that they should get everything because the divorce is somebody else's fault. We have no fault divorce here, so that's not really how it works. It's normal for this to be an emotional process, right? People do go through their stages of grief, and they get angry and they get sad and they go through all the things, and they should. That's a normal part of the process. But if you, and this is a different number that I have down here, fighting for the principle of the matter, people say, well, I want him to be sorry, and I'm going to do this because I want to make sure that they're sorry. Whenever you fight for what we call the principle of the thing, it's going to cost you a lot of principle. You're going to pay a lot of money to not always come out ahead. So you have to really think about what matters to you and get your priorities in line.
Yeah.
And sometimes people get too narrow in their view. They look at just what's going to happen in the next 1 month or 2 months and don't consider what their life could be like in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. You have to have both a short view and a long view to get through this process and know that you're going to be okay. And the last one is just sometimes people become too attached to personal property or replaceable things. Again, if you've got a grandfather clock that was in your family for 100 years, or you've got something, those are things worth fighting about. But your kitchen towels are not worth fighting about, because you will pay a lawyer enough to go get 10 sets of kitchen towels just arguing about the kitchen towels, right? And that sometimes comes back to the principle of the thing. Someone will say, but it's not fair because they are keeping all the towels and all the sheets. And you're like, I understand that, right? But
yeah,
you want to pay $1,000 to argue about sheets, more power to you, but probably you don't.
Yeah. Has to speak to the emotional nature of the divorce more than anything in those moments, I would imagine. I saw the picture of the splitting of the Beanie Babies.
Yes.
That reminds me of that.
That's a real case. I'll see if I can find it. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, this is 1999, right? So it's an old photo, but people were arguing over the Beanie Babies. I had a case where people were arguing over the Fiesta wear. And so the court said, all right, you are going to divide the Fiesta ware 50-50, which for those of you who don't know, Fiesta ware is a kind of dishes. And there's old Fiesta ware that is valuable, but you can also buy new Fiesta ware like at Target and is not valuable. So the judge said, you take turns choosing, right? Husband chooses a piece and then wife chooses a piece. And then they get there to do it. And husband chooses the gravy boat. And wife says, well, you can't also have the lid to the gravy boat because that's another piece. So then she takes the lid to the gravy boat, right? And lawyers just pound their head against a wall for things like that.
Yeah.
And I tell people you're never going to regret being the bigger person, right? It doesn't mean you have to let the other person take advantage of you. But if you wrestle with a pig in the mud, the pig's going to enjoy it and you're going to get dirty.
Mhm.
So to the extent you can keep on the high road, and you can't always, and I understand that,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes things do get dirty and you can't let somebody take advantage of you. But if you can get through a divorce and at the end still be proud of how you handled it, that'll serve you so well in the long run as compared to the person who perhaps wasn't the bigger person and tried to cheat or lie and got caught and created all kinds of problems and drama.
That's good advice. We see in our practice too, this is, I'm shifting gears a little bit, but from a financial perspective, we see about half of the people that go through divorce really understand that their situation has changed and they need to kind of recalibrate. And then there's about 50% that seem like they struggle to accept the new reality. And I think it's it's
Yeah.
a hugely emotional thing, but I don't know, with the, yeah.
Well, and particularly if one person has been leaning toward divorce for a while, that doesn't necessarily mean they've planned for divorce, but maybe they did. But maybe they knew it was coming and they kind of got themselves emotionally ready.
Mhm.
Even if they were financially transparent and on the up and up, they get to a divorce process in a much different place than the person who just found out yesterday.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, there's a lawyer in town who makes the joke that says, if one person has been sipping divorce out of a teacup, the other person ends up drinking it out of a fire hose.
That's
And that doesn't mean it's going to end up to be a different result. And it doesn't even mean that you can't reach a settlement. It just means that you can't expect somebody to make reasonable decisions for their future when they're drinking out of a fire hose. You have to let people go through their grief while they're going through the legal process.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious, a couple questions. I've been asking them all along the way, so a couple more questions. But when someone is coming to you, what do you typically say to expect from a cost perspective?
What
For
I
your
tell
fees?
Well, and what I tell people is getting divorced is like a chess game. We can know where we're going to start and we may even know where we want to end up, but I can't tell you all the moves in between because I don't know what their moves are, right?
Mhm.
If you came to me and you said, we got married last week in Las Vegas, we don't have anything, we don't have any kids, we've completely agreed, that's maybe 3 hours of a lawyer's time. That's insignificant.
Mhm.
But if we start a case and maybe the person thinks that everything is amicable and agreeable, but now the other side is fighting over custody and they're hiring experts and they're asking that, the kids go to counseling and the cost be split and they're asking for their attorney fees, right? I don't know that I can answer that because even if we were only talking about our fees,
Mhm.
we don't know how much fighting we have to do for everything else that's going on.
Right.
I mean, I think it would be difficult to get divorced with any kind of substantial assets for probably less than $20,000 or $25,000.
Yeah.
But it can happen, and obviously it depends on how much you're fighting about.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. How long does the process typically take?
I generally tell people the average is 9 months to a year.
Okay.
Again, in the situation where you just recently got married, there is a mandatory 60-day waiting period. So even if you came right now and said, I want to get a divorce right now today, and the other person agreed, even if we got all the documents drafted and signed today,
Mhm.
the court will not enter a decree for at least 60 days after the recipient, so the defendant, after that person got served with the complaint.
Mhm.
Most of the time, it's more like 9 months or a year. If there are business valuations or other complex issues, it can obviously take longer than that.
Yeah.
And on a rare occasion, we've had something like the parties are halfway through their divorce and somebody files bankruptcy and then everything's frozen for a while.
Mhm.
But generally 9 months to a year is probably a reasonable expectation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. Is there anything that you would say or advise for people to, be in a better spot, like post-divorce? Like, I feel like, some do well, some don't, and there's probably a lot of factors with that. But is there a mind shift sort of thing that can kind of help people get through the tough times and then move on,
The, the,
with their
and
life?
that's another example where the perfect answer to that is to have a team of an investment advisor, a financial planner, and a lawyer, or some combination thereof, right? Because we want to have someone, we can talk about what your legal rights are, and maybe you're going to get X dollars up front, and then you're going to get X dollars over time. And to sit down with someone and plan what that can look like, right? Like, do you need that immediate money to buy a house? Or could you invest that immediate money and have it grow and maybe make some house payments? And it depends on what the market's doing at any given time, right? If the market is terrible, maybe you do want to buy a house, or maybe you want to do something else. But investment advisors' job, for the most part, is to try to figure out how to maximize that money. And so if the lawyer can figure out the planned stream of money and how it's going to look, then taking that to a financial advisor for help is going to be ideal.
Yeah, that makes sense. The financial planning process that we go through with folks really helps, because I think it's hard to kind of understand for the average person. I'm getting some assets, I'm getting some income streams, I qualify for some Social Security on my own, or maybe spousal, depending on the rules. And to try to lay that out over a lifetime is hard to comprehend today. But if we establish a financial plan where we can use some software to help us identify those things and do some projections. It's never perfect. I mean, the second you create a financial plan, it's probably wrong, but it gets us a lot closer to right by utilizing those tools. So
that's exactly right. And people are scared, and I understand why they're scared. And sometimes even if the outcome isn't all the things they thought they wanted or needed, just to have some certainty around, some comfort with the idea that someone is helping them with their finances goes a long way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not gender specific, but sometimes it tends to be gender specific. If I have, for example, a wife who hasn't been terribly involved in the finances, they don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
And to have someone be able to sit down with them and explain some options goes a long, long way.
Yeah. I feel like they're often very nervous about that initial meeting when they don't have much awareness about their financial situation. I think they feel like they should know more, and they might feel embarrassed, they're emotional, there's a lot of things. But just know, whether it's us or other financial planners out there, like, we're not judging. We just want to help. We just want to help. We want to gather information. We want to create a plan so that they can move forward. And so anyway,
you can't be a divorce lawyer and be a judgmental person.
Yeah.
It can't work, right?
Yeah.
And whatever has happened to you, we've probably seen something like it before. Maybe not exactly. Everyone's story is different. Like we said, no one's marriage is the same, no one's divorce is the same, but there are some common themes, and you should never be ashamed. And one of the pieces of advice in choosing a lawyer is, you may interview lots of different lawyers, but you just need to find the lawyer who you can trust to turn your matter over to. It's never the lawyer's decision. Every major decision belongs to the client. But you have to be able to trust that the person is trying to work through things on your behalf so that you can not ruminate on it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah. No, that's good. Well, I think we're at our time. Very much appreciate you being here and your expertise, and just your relationship through the years with Flagstone, and look forward to working together many years in the future.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks,
Bye,
Jake.
everybody.
Yep.
Thank
All
you.
right. Bye-bye.